Welcome back to the channel. Well, I'm still on this journey. Um, I am serious about cracking this thing. Um, wasn't just tongue in cheek. Very serious about that. And so I'm examining every bit of information that I'm being sent, and even stuff that I'm finding on the internet doing um, my own search. So there's a lot of information, you guys, a lot. Tonight, I want to talk to you about the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Book of Jubilees, the fragments in the Dead Sea Scrolls, and basically what all this information is information that people are drawing from to to say this is a thing. And I'm trying really hard to see this because the thing is, if I can prove that this is the real calendar, you're going to see some crazy stuff with me. All right. I have no problem walking away from things that are not true. You just go back and look through history of this channel. When I came into the name, when I came into the real Shabbat, the rapture, all that kind of stuff. When I find the truth, I make correction. Okay, so that is well known with me. I have no problem saying that I'm wrong. If I'm wrong about what I believe right now and what I've been teaching, I will be the first to repent and tell you that I was wrong. So I'm very serious about this. I'm a little disappointed that I can't get anybody to come forward and to sit down with me through Zoom or whatever and discuss this. Help me to see it. I'm having to piece all this stuff together using what you guys have sent me and things that I'm finding on the internet. I cannot find one teacher, and I've messaged a few, that can explain this to me. Matter of fact, Brother Gerald unfriended me and blocked me because I asked the question, where's this in the Bible? Can you show me this in the Bible? And his answer to me was, it's not in the Bible. It's in the Dead Sea Scrolls in fragments. Okay, I will work with that. I will go and look and see what I can find on the Dead Sea Scrolls and on these fragments. Okay, and even gosh, brother, I'm sorry, I probably shouldn't even say your name, but I've been talking with a brother that came out of Remnant House with Gerald that is on the Zadok as well, and he couldn't tell me. He said basically the same thing. It's in fragments from the Dead Sea Scrolls. So I'm looking there. We're going to talk about that. But we're going to talk about the main three people groups from the time before Yeshua, during Yeshua, and after Yeshua. All historical. We're going to be talking about the book of Jubilees. We're going to actually read Jubilee 6 because this is one of the chapters that I noticed that the Zadok people like, and they're the biggest proponents of the lunar solar calendar, love to throw Jubilee 6 out there as if it's evidence against the lunar solar calendar. And I think it actually is contrary to what they say. I think it's actually evidence of the lunar solar. So we're going to cover that. And then we're going to look at, Psalms, Isaiah, and 1 Samuel at a couple of things. So hang with me. If you're very serious about learning the calendar of the Bible, go on this journey with me. Comment down below. Let me know what you're thinking, what you're observing. I just want the truth, you guys. I don't want to, cause trouble or stir the pot or, bring strife or none of that stuff. I do get frustrated though with the amount of confusion that I see and the amount of different, because this is not just one side or the other. This is like 5 sides against other 5 sides. It's 10 different ways to go on the calendar that people are keeping. It is so much confusion that it saddens me because I believe the Bible contains everything we need to know to figure this out, to be honest. and why this particular group wants to go outside the Bible and pull together pieces. And guys, I am trying really hard to understand this and to get this. And so far, I'm not impressed. I can see bullet points. I can see how you get from A to B to C. I can see it. But it is a huge leap. It is a huge leap, and you got to have a lot of faith that what you're believing is factual. For instance, the Dead Sea Scrolls. The main part of the Dead Sea Scrolls, it's not like that there is a calendar that is in a scroll form that we can see and say, oh, that's the Zadok calendar. No, what it is fragments of scrolls, little pieces, and on the fragments, it has words and phrases, just a few. And in each of these cases that we can see that there is a calendar involved, it involves the priestly courses. And with the priestly courses, priests would serve certain amount of days in each month until they fulfilled their term, and it was like a rotation. So not any given one priest would be on call all the time, right? There was a rotation involved. And so this was on the calendar. However, the calendar wasn't about the priestly order. The calendar was about the grain. That is a historical fact. It is an agricultural calendar that the priest lived by. So we can't take fragments of Dead Sea Scrolls talking about the priestly order, which was on the calendar, and construct a completely different calendar. Let's talk about the logic of that. We're talking about fragments. So let's imagine a 1,000 piece puzzle, jigsaw puzzle. And we got it on the table. It's all mixed up, and we choose randomly 5, 6, 7, maybe 10 pieces. Let's pull randomly 10 pieces, and then take the rest of them and put them off to the side, and then lay those 10 pieces on the table. And this is without knowing what the puzzle is about. Okay, we're making assumptions. Maybe we have an idea, but we don't know what the picture is, the complete picture. How do we make sense of only having 10 pieces of the puzzle? How do we draw doctrine out of that? Because I think that's dangerous. But I'm still with you. I'm still willing to go with some of what you're saying and examine that. But just that alone, because one of the biggest things I hear is, oh, it's not in the Bible, it's in the Dead Sea Scroll in fragments. Okay. We're going to talk about that. All right. I want to get into the three people groups that are there and what the Dead Sea Scrolls and who the Essenes are in this, because I think we are superimposing another people group called the Zadok with a group called the Essenes. Let me show you why, because I came across this guy here. This is amazing. Let's Talk Religion. I'm going to use his video for educational purposes, you guys, because I don't need to reinvent the wheel here. Okay, so this guy has done his due diligence on the subject, and he's telling us about it. Okay, so we're going to use what he has gleaned from the Dead Sea Scrolls. And there's a reason for this, because it's going to lay down something, and there's a huge revelation in this, by the way. Huge, because I found data points in this that point to a people group. And it's who the people today identify as the Zadok. You're going to see that in just a moment in this guy's presentation. Hang with me. And we're going to go over Jubilees after this, okay? So hang tight. Here we go. All right, so we're talking at Let's Talk Religion. This guy's pretty good. I'm going to play it a little faster because we want to get through it. We don't want to dwell.
1846, one of the most
talk about this.
Groundbreaking archaeological discoveries of the 20th century was made near the Dead Sea. Documents and ancient texts were found in caves in this region. These came to be given the name the Dead Sea Scrolls, an amazing collection including some of the earliest examples of biblical scriptures we have, as well as other texts not included in the biblical canon that shed light on religion in Judea around the turn of the Common Era. The authors, or at least owners of these texts who lived in a nearby community in Qumran, are often identified as the so-called Essenes, a mysterious Jewish sect that is mentioned in several ancient sources. But who were these Essenes, and what are their connection, if any, to the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Qumran community? Ancient Judaism looked quite different from the religion as we know it today. Rabbinic Judaism only started to form essentially after the destruction of the Second Temple in the year 70 AD. And before this, there existed many different groups of Jews who approached and understood the religion in various different ways. This is true today too, of course, but the differences back then between these groups are arguably even more fundamental. Around the turn of the Common Era and in the few centuries before, most of Judaism was centered in the lands of Judea and Israel, and in particular around the city of Jerusalem, where the Great Temple stood. For this reason, we find reference to different groups of Jews in the New Testament and Gospel accounts. There are, of course, the Pharisees who show up to challenge Jesus in the Gospels, as well as the Sadducees, who are the priestly and upper class associated with the maintenance of the temple. But in ancient accounts, we also...
And I would also suggest, folks, he doesn't need to talk about two others that are mentioned in the New Testament, one being the Zealots. There were several different sects that the Nazarenes, or you know, what Yeshua was, which would be the equivalent, folks, hate to tell you, but Yeshua would be the equivalent of a Karaite Jew today, to be honest, only following the Torah. That's going to offend a lot of people, I understand that. But if you look at everything that Yeshua stood for, it's basically the same thing as Nehemiah Gordon believes. By the way, I believe Nehemiah Gordon is a closet believer in Yeshua. I know many Jews that are. Okay, just putting that out there.
To find references to other groups. The famous first-century Jewish writer and historian Flavius Josephus wrote a work called The Jewish War, in which he describes three main sects of Judaism at the time. What? Indeed, there exist among the Jews three schools of philosophy. The Pharisees belong to the first, the Sadducees to the second, and to the third belong men who have a reputation for cultivating a particularly saintly life called Essene.
Notice he doesn't say anything about a group called the Zadok, or the Zadokah, or even Zadok, or sons of Zadok. No, none of it. We do see this in the Bible. Ezekiel talks about the sons of Zadok in the end times, even talks about the calendar, but no reference to it being a Zadok calendar that's fixed starting on a Wednesday from creation, that's every Saturday. Okay? It doesn't. So most scholars across the board agree there's basically three, maybe four, sometimes five if you consider Yeshua's sect. Yeshua was a Nazarite, so those that followed Yeshua in Hebrew was called Netzarim. Okay, that was, and Paul was called a Netzarim. Right? So there are other sects. No Zadok.
So who are these Essenes? They appear to have been a
I can't find
community in antiquity, but essentially died out around the time that Josephus was writing. Well, this group in fact remains rather mysterious even to this day, and we don't have a lot of material to work with. Or do we? We'll return to the question of Qumran later, which might be a decisive factor here. But in terms of information about the Essenes, their beliefs, practices, we are limited to a few historical sources. In particular, there are three ancient writers that mention or describe this Essene community. The already mentioned Josephus, there is Philo of Alexandria, the great Platonist Jewish philosopher of the first century, and Pliny the Elder, a famous Roman natural philosopher. So what do these accounts have to say about?
By the way, you guys, I don't know if you know this or not, but Josephus and Philo both write about the calendar in their writings. They talk about some nuances of how the calendar was observed. And by the way, it coincides. I'll just hold there. I don't want to overwhelm you. I want you to watch this video. And I don't want to scare you away thinking I'm trying to indoctrinate you into something else. I am doing a due diligent search in this calendar. And so far, well, let's continue.
About the Essenes. Well, the Essenes appear to have been a strongly, you could say, ascetic community. They seem to have been spread out across Judea.
The Essenes. Interesting in this video, in this picture, that all the Essenes are wearing all white. I know another group that does this.
But lived primarily in villages and smaller communities, avoiding cities probably to remain pure and untainted by the worldliness and faulty practices of city dwellers. Philo suggests that at the time that he wrote his Every Good Man is Free, there were around 4,000 Essenes living in this region. The Essenes are described as a community that took the Jewish law very seriously, like unusually seriously. They lived a very strict life centered on worship and ritual purity. When you became part of the community, you gave up all your possessions, and all goods were basically the property of the community as a whole. There was a hierarchy with managers on top and new initiates at the bottom. To become part of the community, you had to go through a long process of several years of study before earning your place. Some Essenes seem to have lived in closed-off communities, such as perhaps in Qumran, where, as we saw, all property belonged to the group as a whole. The regular day was spent in prayer and study of the Hebrew scripture.
And by the way, you heard what he just said. That is true. The community of Qumran existed, archaeologists say, for about 300 years, 150 years before Yeshua, roughly Maccabean time, and then 150 years after, which was commonly understood from those scholars or historians we just saw. The Essenes were in the later years, okay? So we need to understand that. The Essenes did not, nor did any other group, occupy Qumran for those 300 years. It was more than a dozen different groups, folks, and this is why there's so much layering in the archaeology that they found there. By the way, Jeremiah hid the temple treasure there. We can find this in the Copper Scroll. So there's a whole thing about that we're not even covering in this. And I believe Jeremiah is probably the reason why we find a lot of scrolls from the temple and scrolls that probably shouldn't have been in that library in Qumran. And I have a theory on why we find so many fragments of scrolls in Qumran. There's a reason for that. Have you ever asked why? Why would there be so many fragments, right? Because there's literally thousands and thousands of fragments. There's a reason for that. We're going to reveal that later.
As well as strictly regulated daily communal meals. There was also a huge emphasis on ritual purity, where the members would regularly purify themselves in water, so bathing essentially. When not praying, they would work, primarily with agriculture, except of course on the Sabbath, which was observed with extreme strictness. No work was permitted, and this included things like lighting a fire or just carrying an object. It seems that these Essenes were primarily a male community and that they might have lived in celibacy, shunning all forms of romantic relationships to instead focus on strictly following the Jewish law. However, Josephus reports that some Essenes did allow marriage and that sex was allowed within the context of that marriage, but absolutely forbidden outside of that particular context. So sex was only meant to create new children, for procreation, but was forbidden for any other circumstance. As for their beliefs, they were Jews, obviously, so they followed the Torah and the Hebrew Bible in general, as well as possibly some extra biblical material, if there's indeed a connection with the Dead Sea Scrolls. The Essenes appear to have been influenced by or been a part of what is known as Jewish apocalypticism, a theological movement popular at around this time, which introduced some new and unique features to the religion. For example, this can be seen in the fact that the Essenes believed that the human soul was eternal and immortal, that it had become trapped or attached to the human body, but would survive after its demise. Furthermore, they believed that the afterlife was a spiritual one and not physical, that the soul was subject to a judgment by God after death, and that those who were good in this life would be rewarded with a pleasant spiritual afterlife, while those who were wicked would be punished and face terrible retribution after death. These ideas, which had become common in Jewish thought in late antiquity, would of course come to serve as central aspects of Christianity and Islam too. If these ancient literary sources can be trusted, then we seem to know quite a bit about the Essenes and their general characteristics. But do we have anything from the Essenes themselves in terms of writings? Well, this is where we get back to that original question, which is, what is, if any, the connection between the Essenes and the so-called Dead Sea Scrolls? The Dead Sea Scrolls were an amazing archaeological find back in the mid-20th century. There are many legendary stories surrounding their discovery, but the common narrative is that two Bedouin shepherds stumbled upon a cave near Qumran in which they found several scrolls stored in jars. This discovery, which took place between 1946 to 1947, would pass through many hands as it gradually became clear that this was a rather significant find. In the following years and decades, more and more caves were found in this area which contained similar scrolls. This is an incredibly fascinating thing, and it's still ongoing. As recently as last year in 2021, there were more.
So you guys, needless to say, it's a vast library. And like I said, it probably came from, and I'm speculating here. I'm admitting that I'm speculating. And I'm drawing this from what I've read from text, and even extra biblical text, because you got to see this in the Copper Scrolls. You can even see in gosh, It's slipping me right now, but there's a couple of apocrypha that talk about Jeremiah and Baruch. You guys that are watching the video, you can tell me who it is. I know you do, you know it, but it's slipping me right now because I've been cramming, so I can't possibly. I don't even take notes. I can't possibly remember every detail, and that's why I watch and study things over and over and over and over again. Repetition is how I learn.
Fragments discovered in similar
So
conditions.
these fragments that they're talking about is destroyed scrolls. They were intentionally destroyed. This is not degradation of the scroll over many years. Okay. Someone intentionally destroyed those scrolls that are fragments.
In the region. So this is a region that has contributed with some really significant archaeological materials since the initial discovery. So what are these Dead Sea Scrolls? What is in them? The scrolls, which many scholars today prefer to call the Qumran scrolls, contain fragments from many different kinds of texts. Some of these fragments are full scrolls containing entire books from the Bible, while others are tiny fragments of parchment of only a few words.
This is what I'm talking about. Fragments. And some even smaller than this. Some are you know, maybe cut right there and you only see just two lines of some words. But it's many, many fragments, folks. When scribes made a mistake or there was something wrong with a scroll, and especially if it had Yahuwah's name in it, they did not destroy this. They, first of all, had to destroy the scroll, but they could not burn it. You cannot burn something that has Yahuwah's name on it, first of all. So the only way to destroy it was to rip it up into shreds and make it useless, and being very careful not to rip the name of the Most High. Matter of fact, those pieces were taken away from the actual scrolls that are being destroyed. I get this from scholars that tell me this is probably the reason why we see so many scrolls that have been destroyed. It was the job of the scribes to destroy scrolls that had mistakes, or when they made mistakes, or it was scrolls that were useless. That's why they're ripped up, folks.
Words or so. The majority of these texts are biblical, copies of the books of the Hebrew Bible and commentaries or other texts related to the books of the Hebrew Bible. In fact, about a quarter of the scrolls are simply, well, books from the Hebrew Bible. But this is still very significant because this makes them some of the earliest copies of the Bible. Before the discovery of the scrolls, the oldest manuscripts of the Bible we had were basically from the 9th to 10th century. Here, instead, we now have examples of those same texts, but from way earlier, from the turn of the Common Era and maybe even from the first few centuries BC. It's also significant, of course, that these scrolls include slightly altered versions of these biblical texts. Before the so-called Masoretic text became standardized around 100 AD, there were different variations of the biblical text that circulated. It was always a fluid collection of text, and the finds at Qumran reflect this. Now, most of the differences from the standard Bible are very minor, but it's still very significant from a historical point of view. Aside from these standard books from the Hebrew Bible, the scrolls also included what is known as apocrypha and pseudepigrapha. In other words, books that are not included in most versions of the biblical canon. The apocrypha include books that are only part of the Catholic Old Testament, but not the Hebrew Tanakh or the Protestant Bible, such as the Book of Tobit. Secondly, the pseudepigrapha include books that are not part of any Bible, basically. It is here that we find texts like the famous and incredibly fascinating books of Enoch and the Book of Jubilees.
Now, here's where it gets really interesting to me, because somebody revered these two books. Now, these are part, as he said, a part of the Apocrypha. It was not included in the canon. It is mentioned in the Bible, but scholars have reasons why they don't hold these books to high regard. There's a reason for it. And I told you about the Book of Jubilees having an interpolator, and the Jubilees contradicts itself in several places. Okay, so there's reasons why. But even with that said, what the Zadok people use from these books is very interesting to me. And we're going to cover that, okay? We're going to read some from Book of Jubilees in just a moment. But I wanted to point this out. This is what, because there's the Book of Enoch and the Book of Jubilees, the Zadok people have picked up on that. And because it was at Qumran, it is now canonical, in other words, and apparently above the Bible. And I'm being very frank with you. That's what I see. It's apparently above the Bible. Because when you compare and contrast and you see the contradictions, in any contradiction scenario, I'm going with the Bible. That's just me. You can do what you want to do. I'm just presenting this evidence to you, and you make the choice. Okay?
Then there are works that are often deemed sectarian works, in other words, texts that were written by and for a specific community, in this case, probably the community living in Qumran, and which gives us details about their beliefs and practices. These include texts like the so-called community rule, the Damascus documents, and the so-called war scroll. And then there are a bunch of commentaries on and shorter summaries of biblical books as well. So as you can see, the Qumran scrolls include a lot of different books and different kinds of books. Many of these are the biblical books that we all know and love, but others are unfamiliar to most. The books of Enoch, for example, has become famous for their strange stories about the Watchers, and this would require a whole separate episode to cover properly. Nonetheless, these Qumran or Dead Sea Scrolls are probably the most significant archaeological discovery of the 20th century that has revolutionized our understanding of Second Temple Judaism and the New Testament period in this region of the world. But who were the people that wrote them, or who owned them and presumably hid them in these caves? As we said, the caves in which the scrolls were found were all located around a place called Qumran, today an archaeological site that seems to have been the settlement of a peculiar community. A community of Jews who lived rather strict lives dedicated to the observance of Jewish law. We know of this Qumran community both from the actual site at Qumran, but also in texts like the Community Rule and the War Scroll that seem to detail the way that they lived and some of what they believed. The Qumran community and the larger sect that they belonged to seem to have broken off from the other groups of Jews that were centered around the temple in Jerusalem. They believed that the temple had been taken over by false priests and rejected the temple cult in Jerusalem.
That is true, folks. That is true. We can see that. I mentioned to you in one of the last videos about in one of those scrolls where the writer is talking about the wicked priest. Okay, and most scholars believe this is Judah Maccabee because this is when the priesthood went off the rails, and it was Jews in there and not Levites. The Levites were out. All and apparently all the way up into Yeshua, because we see John the Baptist, who was a Levite, that was basically exiled. So there was problems where the political appointment of priest, especially in the time of Yeshua, forced Levites out. So we had John the Baptist, whose father was a priest. We can see this in the story before Yeshua was born. This is the priest that couldn't speak anymore until the son was born. Remember the story? Zacharias, he was a priest, which means his son, John the Baptist, a Levite priest. John was in the wilderness. But nowhere in the Bible do we hear him called a Zadok or an Essene or anything like that, okay? But there was contention from the people who were in Qumran about the corruption of, and that would have been with several other sects too. Yeshua came against the corrupt system.
Instead choosing to gather in places of their own where they could follow their strict interpretation of the law. In the words of the archaeologist Jody Magnus, quote, Qumran was occupied by members of a wider movement that separated from the rest of the Jews in Judea around the middle of the 2nd century BCE or earlier over differences in the interpretation and practice of Jewish law. In general, this sect was stricter in its interpretation of Jewish law than other Jews. It seems like they believed that the cults in the Jerusalem temple were performed incorrectly and that the law wasn't followed properly, so they instead formed a strongly hierarchical community of their own, centered on priests of the Zadokite lineage, which had led the temple practices in Jerusalem previously. Membership was limited to adult males who were deemed worthy, and the initiation process seemed to have been long, taking years. Our sources also suggest that once one became a member,
Zadokite lineage is Levite. Okay, it's not another people group.
Had to give up at least a portion of your possessions to the community as a whole. As we saw, the Qumran community seems to be only one settlement of a larger movement or community across Judea. Archaeology suggests that there were probably around 150 to 200 people living in the settlement at any given time. And from texts like the Community Rule, it also seems like this might have been an especially strict environment. Members of the wider community could be married and have kids, but the group in Qumran in particular appeared to have lived a life of celibacy. Their lives were governed by a very strict code of conduct, being very meticulous to follow every aspect of the Jewish law, and harsh punishments for those who didn't. Members could be excommunicated for failing to follow the rules properly or be punished for what we would consider very minor things. For example, the Damascus document states that if a person accidentally fell asleep during a communal meeting, they would be expelled for 30 days and had to do penance for 10 days on top of that. One of the more central aspects of their daily lives included communal meals, as well as a very strong emphasis on ritual purity. Indeed, the archaeological site at Qumran contains several so-called mikvahs, or baths, where the members would purify themselves on a regular basis. This emphasis on ritual purity seems to have been especially important to the Qumran community, not only based on the existence of these mikvah baths, but also on their beliefs and their view of themselves based on these texts. Indeed, the community appears to have seen itself as a kind of substitute for the temple in Jerusalem. Again, in the words of Jody Magnus, quote, "In other words, these sectarians conducted their lives as if the community was a virtual temple or tabernacle. For this reason, they observed the same strict regulations governing purity, including immersion and purity of food, drink, and dishes as those required for the temple cult. Instead of the daily sacrifices in the temple of Jerusalem, the Qumran community replaced this with 2 daily prayers that everyone performed, even though sacrifices also seem to have taken place. The community was the temple, a replacement of the now defunct temple until the future redemption when Jerusalem would be ruled by the true priests again. We thus find a community that thought very highly of themselves. They were the real Israel and the only ones who were following the law properly. The end times were very close, as indicated from the sectarian scrolls, and they were at the verge of a new messianic era in which they represented the sons of light and all others were the so-called sons of darkness. These forces would engage in a 40-year war in which the sons of light would eventually win.
And by the way, you guys, there's no indication that they accepted Yeshua as the Messiah. That needs to be noted. These that were in Qumran did not consider Yeshua as the Messiah. I don't care what you think about the Moreh Zadok. The Moreh Zadok, the righteous teacher, is not talking about Yeshua.
Drive out the Romans and reestablish true worship in the Jerusalem temple. The war also had cosmic significance in which the earthly war was mirrored in a cosmic war between the forces of good and evil, represented by angels and the demonic forces of Satan. In other words, the Qumran community definitely belonged to the wider movement of antiquity known as Jewish apocalypticism, which we mentioned earlier. All these ideas are found in the sectarian scrolls found in the caves surrounding the Qumran site, which explains the origins, current practices, and future predictions that they had of themselves. In terms of practices, they, as we've said, follow the laws of the Torah with an unusual strictness, as well as emphasize rituals of purity in the mikvah baths and communal dining. Another thing that made the Qumran community stand out is the fact that they used a solar calendar rather than the moon calendar of the other Jews. This meant that the different sacred days of the year would fall on different dates than for the rest of the Jews, which, for those members of the sect who lived in larger villages and towns, would probably create some tensions with their neighbors. This was also a very hierarchical community. The priest ruled supreme and had full power. The group had a highest authority called the Mebakar, the guardian, also called the master, who presided over the community, taught them how to conform to the law, and in general, supervised the whole sect.
An overseer. An overseer. Yeah. Whatever the group do you know of that lives in a desert and wears white and has an overseer? Can you think of any? I think it's all modeled around the Essenes, and it's just labeled as Zadok.
As for the origins of the sect, we have only a few hints. In the Damascus document, we find reference to the founder of the sect as someone called the teacher of righteousness, a person who had a proper understanding of the Torah and could guide.
The Moreh Zadok is the teacher of righteousness. That's in the Dead Sea Scrolls, but it wasn't Yeshua. Some say that's Yeshua. No, this was somebody that was in Qumran. And if Yeshua was in Qumran, there would be stories of Yeshua in Qumran.
The community to counter all the things that the Jerusalem Israelites had misunderstood or done wrong. This person's actual identity from a historical perspective isn't known since he is hidden behind this nickname. And there are other such anonymous figures mentioned in the scrolls that appear important, such as the so-called wicked priest, the sprouter of lies, and the kittim. With the exception of the last term, kittim, which most scholars agree probably refers to the Romans, there is no consensus on who all of these figures are. The wicked priest and spouter of lies probably refers to some figures associated with the Jerusalem clergy, possibly Jonathan Maccabeus, a key figure of the Maccabean revolt and a leader of the Hasmonean dynasty that ruled Judea. But
and others say it was Judah. I said this at first in my other video that I did, but further research, it was actually Judah, I believe, some say.
Let's disagree on these questions. It seems relatively clear that they at least represent the enemies of the Essenes, namely the other sects of Judaism at the time, the Pharisees and the Sadducees. As for the so-called teacher of righteousness, there have been many theories of all kinds. He has been identified sometimes with John the Baptist, with Jesus himself, James the Just, and much more. All of these theories are generally rejected by scholars today, though. The only indication we have is that the term righteousness, Zadok in Hebrew, seems to refer to the Zadokite lineage of priests who lost monopoly over the temple after the Maccabean revolt. It is thus possible that the community...
All right, folks, did you hear what he just said? Zadok. Zadok. So sons of Zadok would be called Zadokim, not Zadokah. Folks, you can go and look at yourself. Those 4 letters, Zadokah means justice. It means mercy. It sometimes means purity, depending. It's a verb. It's a verb. Justice, mercy, and action. When you examine, when you exalt justice or you put mercy, Zadokah, that's what it means.
That the Qumran group belonged to was founded by priests of the Zadokite lineage who considered the new clergy in Jerusalem to be illegitimate. And this kind of leads us to the million-dollar question: were the Qumran community Essenes? Many scholars, probably the majority of scholars, historians today, argue that they indeed were. You may have noticed that the descriptions of the Essenes in the ancient writers like Josephus and Philo is very similar to the ideas and practices of the Qumran community. A very strict adherence to the law, an emphasis on ritual purity, communal meals, selective celibacy, and much else. There's so much fascinating stuff when it comes to the beliefs of the Qumran community.
And by the way, folks, the reason why these guys were there was not because of the calendar. They did not, it wasn't a disagreement over the calendar. It was a disagreement over the priesthood. There was a wicked priest. And it came from the Maccabees, Jonathan Maccabee, Judah Maccabee, one of the two. And these guys did not agree with it. Now, there could have been Levites. There could have been some Levites in there, but the chances are they were just religious people that had taken a vow of celibacy, because these were mostly men, and the temple had gone all to hell, and so they removed themselves and went and did their own thing. By the way, most scholars call them Gnostics. That's what they were, Gnostics. This is not Yeshua's righteous people, folks. The Essenes. And that's who I believe the Zadok people believe is the Zadok Ka, as they say. I disagree. Everything that I see from scholars and from looking at the priestly order in fragments, folks, not even complete scrolls. I'm discouraged in thinking that people follow after a calendar that cannot even be proven and is completely separate from the Bible. For the exception of what they use from Ezekiel, talking about, the sons of righteousness, the calendar, everything being restored, that help me, Father.
I've actually turned to an expert who's going to tell you even more about a particular aspect of their theology, namely Dr. Andrew Henry from the channel Religion for Breakfast.
Thanks, Philip. Another reason why many scholars believe that the Qumran community and the Essenes are one and the same is because of fate. What do I mean by that? In a passage comparing the Sadducees, Pharisees, and Essenes, Josephus says that the Essenes were somewhat skeptical of free will. He says the Essenes declare that fate is the mistress of all things, and that nothing befalls people unless it is in accordance with her decree. By comparison, the Sadducees completely reject fate and emphasize that humans have free will, and the Pharisees take a middle position. We can call the Essene theological position on fate a strong sense of predeterminism. My Dead Sea Scrolls professor in graduate school, Jonathan Klawans, even joked that the Essenes were the Calvinists of Second Temple Judaism, holding to the theological position of predestination. In other words, the Essenes believed in God's absolute foreknowledge of and control over future events, and lead toward the denial of free choice. Possible parallels for this strong predeterminism have been found in the Dead Sea Scrolls. For example, in the sectarian document called the Community Rule, we find what Dr. Klawans calls the clearest articulation of predestination in all of ancient Jewish literature. From the God of knowledge comes all that is and shall be. Before ever they existed, he established their whole design. And when, as ordained for them, they came into being, it is in accordance with his glorious design that they accomplish their task without change. The text goes on to say that God has ordained the righteous to walk in the ways of the light and the evil to walk in the ways of darkness. This is predestination. So this may be more evidence that the Qumran community was an Essene community, but not all scholars agree. Josephus seems to be describing an idea of fate influenced by Greek philosophy. He doesn't seem to know about the Qumran idea of predestination, that is more dualistic, but the similarities remain and can't be ignored. Back to you, Philip.
Thank you, Andrew, and please everyone check out his amazing work over at Religion for Breakfast. Philo suggested that there were around 4,000 Essenes living in Judea and that they were spread out into different communities. It seems to many that Qumran was one such community. Furthermore, one of the most suggestive pieces of evidence comes from that third source on the Essenes, Pliny the Elder. He writes, quote, "They, the Essenes, are a people unique of its kind and admirable beyond all others in the whole world, without women and renouncing love entirely, without money and having company only the palm trees. Below the Essenes was the town of En-Gedi, which yielded only to Jerusalem in fertility and palm groves, but has today become another ash heap. From there, one comes to the fortress of Masada." Pliny here seems to geographically place an Essene settlement north of Masada and En-Gedi along the Dead Sea.
By the way, you guys, from Jerusalem to Qumran, that looks like a long way, don't it? You know how many miles that is? Look, the Bethlehem to Jerusalem is even shorter. That is only 12 miles, folks. It's not that far at all. You can walk that in one day. And the fact that Jeremiah and Baruch take all the temple treasure to Qumran, and we can see this in the temple in the Copper Scroll, which is another Dead Sea Scroll. 12 miles. That's as far as it is. So let's say this is the wilderness that John the Baptist was in. And he was, hanging out in Qumran or whatever. Well, we know that he baptized Yeshua on the Jordan River. Jordan River, there it is, the Jordan River right here. It goes up that way. This is just, I guess, is a watershed from the mountains there, because Jerusalem is a high ground, but that's only 12 miles, you guys. It's really interesting to me that we've got so much archaeology just 12 miles from Jerusalem.
Sea, which is exactly where we find Qumran. These points have led many scholars to conclude that the Qumran community indeed represents a group of Essenes. It should be pointed out, though, that there's no consensus on this matter. Many scholars are still skeptical of this connection due to lack of any clear evidence, right? And so the discussion is still ongoing. Scholars will disagree, but I would say that most scholars today accept this connection between the Qumran community and the Essenes. In any case, if we accept this connection, this indeed seems to indicate that it was the Essenes that wrote the Dead Sea Scrolls, or at the very least that these scrolls belonged to that community. Much of what we know about the Essenes does seem to be confirmed. They were a unique sect of Judaism, separated from groups like the Pharisees and Sadducees, who lived around Judea and gathered in communities like Qumran, led by a priestly class and guardians who had absolute authority. They saw themselves as a kind of placeholder temple, since the one in Jerusalem had been corrupted, and followed a very strict observance of the law, as well as practices of communal dining and purification baths. The Essenes also clearly were influenced by the apocalyptic Jewish literature and held strong beliefs that the end of days was approaching, that the dead would be resurrected, and that there would be a judgment from God, a judgment where they believed that they, the so-called sons of light, were the only winners. While they appear to have played a major role in ancient Judea, it seems that shortly after writers like Josephus mentions them, the Essenes no longer existed in any major capacity. The Great War with the Romans in 68 AD, in which Jerusalem and the temple would eventually be destroyed in the year 70, would have almost cataclysmic effects on the larger Jewish community. It seems that groups like the Sadducees and Essenes, including this group in Qumran, did not survive this war and basically died out as a result. Many speculate that it was because of the approaching Roman occupation.
They were all, for the most part, you guys, they were all corralled at Masada, and that's why he mentions this. Most of the Jews, no matter who you were, when Rome brought down the hammer, that it was kill on sight. Okay, so there wasn't nobody 12 miles away from Jerusalem at this time hiding in Qumran. They were running for it, at Masada and eventually killed themselves. Okay, so history shows us that Yeshua's prophecy about the temple and the destruction of Jerusalem happened 70 years after he said it. Okay. All the way up through that time, we've got people from the time of Yeshua. Okay. No mention of a calendar discrepancy in our Bibles anywhere. Yeshua would have addressed it. Folks, if there was a problem with the calendar and keeping the Shabbat, Yeshua would have addressed it. That's common sense. It's a major thing. He didn't, and we can see historically that the calendar wasn't messed with or changed to a Saturday until under Constantine. That's a historical fact, and how we got a Hebrew group of Sabbath keepers who insist that it's a Saturday 7-day continual cycle from creation, and by the way, that day was a Wednesday, is absurd to me, because you cannot prove that. You cannot. And this is why nobody has come forward so far and shown me this. And this is why Gerald Thomas unfriended me and blocked me, because I asked him to show me this and show me. I want to see this. Is it in the Bible? No, it's in the Dead Sea Scrolls in fragments. Block. Erased all my comments. And it wasn't hard, it wasn't hateful comments, folks. I was asking a question, a rational question. And you call yourself a teacher and you're teaching this garbage, but you can't answer a question and come forward and show yourself approved with the word. And I still love you, brother, but that hurt my heart, man. You of all people, I would have not thought would have done that. And I had hopes that you would have sat down with me and explained to me and show me why you believe what you believe. Share that with a brother. Anyway, I want to finish just a couple of minutes more on this, and then we're going to go into the book of Jubilees, because this is a big point with the Zadok people, the book of Jubilees.
Armies that the Qumran community hid all their scrolls in the caves surrounding the site. And indeed, the text from the Qumran scrolls include some of the most famous examples of the so-called apocalyptic literature. The books of Enoch are an incredibly interesting case, which seem to have been important to the Essenes, but which did not make it into the later biblical canon. The only exception is the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, whose Bible includes the book of Enoch. Andrew over on Religion for Breakfast has already made amazing videos about both the first and second Enoch, so if you're interested in that topic, you should definitely go check out his videos on that. The Dead Sea Scrolls in general can also be found in various translations. If you're interested in reading that, I highly recommend it, of course, if you're interested in this topic. They are fascinating texts, and it's a fascinating topic to just dive into. Thanks again to Andrew for being part of this video.
Very good, very good. And I want to say thank you to Let's Talk Religion. Very good information. I appreciate intellectual minds and people that are unbiased. They don't have an agenda. They're not, trying to force something. They're just laying the facts out there for you. There's no agenda there. Okay. The Dead Sea Scrolls was the subject. No mention of the Zadok. We did talk about the Zadok, right? Which are the Levites, but no people group officially acknowledged by the Bible or historian called that. Now we can see mentions from a prophet in the Bible talking about the sons of Zadok. We can clearly see that. Amen. We can see that because they do exist. There's a lineage of Levite priests that still exist. So the book of Jubilees. Let's go there, you guys, because one thing I noticed about the book of Jubilees is I don't think most of the Zadok people have actually gone and read the book of Jubilees. Because reason I say that is because many of them like to say, well, there's no such thing as the word Hodesh. Hodesh and new moon is a mistranslation. They love to say that. Yet none of them have any formal training in Hebrew. And by the way, I do teach a course and have been on basic biblical Hebrew. I can both read it, understand it, speak it a little bit. Not fluent, but I can read Hebrew. I've got a pretty extensive vocabulary, or I wouldn't be teaching the course that I teach. And I happen to know the word does exist. It's not a conspiracy, you guys. We're going to see this of all places in the book of Jubilees. That's why I said I don't believe some of these people have even read book of Jubilees, because in the book of Jubilees it talks about new moons. But here's the thing. I could use the book of Jubilees alone to debunk, if I wanted to, the Zadok calendar. And here's why: because the book of Jubilees contradicts itself in 28 places. And in every case, it's about the calendar. Okay, so let's back up a minute. A few days ago, we talked about Jubilees 2. Okay, remember where there's a place in Jubilees where it says the sun alone dictates the Moedim, and it goes in all the feasts and everything, dictates no mention of the moon. But then yet Jubilees will turn right back around and tell you what the moon does. So there's contradictions of it. Jubilee 6 is one of those places. And it's ironic that some of the protractors of any other calendar but the Zadok like to use, especially the lunar solar calendar, they like to use Jubilee 6 to debunk the lunar solar calendar. And it doesn't do that. When you read the whole thing in its context, you see really clearly that it tells you that if you neglect to keep the calendar correctly according to the moon, you will go wrong. That's what it says. We're going to read it together. You tell me. We're going to read it together, and you can tell me whether I'm lying or am I dying. All right. So I don't understand why Jubilee 6 is used in such a way. And every time I see it, it's a fragment. And it's only that fragment that says, that you will go wrong in your keeping of your seasons and of your feasts and stuff. Let's read it in context, shall we? Book of Jubilees. And by the way, we're going to look at it in the Hebrew as well. Not only in the English, but the Hebrew as well, because you're going to see something really profound. You're going to see a word that the Zadok people says it's not supposed to be there. New moon. Over and over and over again, you see the word new moon. Gerald Thomas will tell you it don't exist. It's all made up. It's a mistranslation. Yet Jubilees has the same word that your Bible does. Let's look at it. And not only him, I'm picking on Gerald a little bit because I want him to engage with me on an intellectual basis, not on a tit for tat. We're fighting. I don't want to fight with anybody. I want to get to the bottom of the truth. And if you care about the truth, then you will do that. Jubilees chapter 6, very first verse. And on the new moon of the 3rd month, he went forth from the ark and built an altar on that mountain. Who did? Enoch. That's who we're talking about here. Right? New moon. Look at the word here. Wa ba'esh. Baresh. Wa baresh. Ha chodesh. Ha shalishi. Yitzah mi. Did you see that? On the new moon, in the 3rd month. Hodesh. New moon. Hodesh. new moon. Look at the word month and moon, new moon, third month, new moon. So if new moon and month are not the same word, then why is Hodesh here? Because Hodesh is a synonym that means head of the month and moon, new moon. That means month and moon. That's a fact, folks. And not only that, we see new moon over and over again in chapter 6. On the new moon in the third month, he went forth from the ark and built on a mountain. Now, there is a contradiction in Jubilee 6 with the Bible. But for the most part, it's telling you truth here on the new moon. In other words, we are keeping a new moon, not a new month. That's the same thing. New moon and new month is the same thing. It's not just month, and it has nothing to do with the moon. You cannot throw away the moon. You cannot ignore the moon. It's in there, okay? And he made atonement for the earth and took a kid and made atonement, talking about a goat, by its blood for all the guilt of the earth, for everything that had been on it and been destroyed, to save those that were in the dark with Noah. And he placed the fat, therefore, on the altar, and took an ox and a goat and a sheep and kids and salt and a turtle-dove and the young of a dove, and placed a burnt offering on the altar, and poured thereof an offering mingled with oil, sprinkled with wine, stewed frankincense over everything, and caused a goodly savor to arise, acceptable before Yah. And Yah smelt the goodly savor, and he made a covenant with him that there should be not any more a flood to destroy the earth. And in all the days of the earth, seed time and harvest should never cease. Talking about grain, cold and heat, summer and winter. The 4 gates talked about in Enoch, the 2 solstices and the 2 equinoxes. It's the 4 gates. Day and night should not change their order, nor cease forever. And you increase ye and multiply upon the earth, and become upon it, and be blessed upon it. The fear of you and the dread of you I shall inspire in everything that is on the earth and in the sea. And behold, I have given unto you all the beasts, all the winged things, and all everything that moveth on the earth, the fish in the waters, and all the things of food, as the green herbs. I give them all things to eat. But the flesh, with the life thereof, with the blood, ye shall not eat. For the life is of flesh is in the blood, lest your blood of your lives be required. And the hand of every man and the hand of every beast I will require the blood of man. Who sheddeth man's blood, by man shall his blood be shed. For in the image of God he made man. And you increase ye and multiply on the earth. And Noah and his sons swore that they would not eat any blood that was in any flesh. And he made a covenant before Yah forever throughout all the generations of the earth in this month. And look at the word there, in Chodesh. So the word month is the same word. Why? Because it's a synonym. Month and new moon is the same thing. When you're talking about the month as a subject, you'll use B'chodesh. When you're talking about the head of the month, Rosh Chodesh, is specifically the new moon, the head of the month. But it also means month. Okay? And he made a covenant before Yah, Elohim, forever, throughout all the generation of the earth in this month, B'chodesh. On this account he spoke to thee that thou should make a covenant with the children of Israel in this month, right? B'chodesh. Upon the mountain in the oath, and thou shalt sprinkle blood upon them because of the words of this covenant, which Yah had made with them forever. And this testimony is written concerning you, that you should observe it continually, that you should not on any day blood of beasts or birds or cattle during the days of the earth. And the man who eateth the blood of the beasts and the cattle of the birds during the days of the earth, and his seed shall be rooted out of the land. And do thou command the children of Israel to eat no blood, so that their names shall and their seed shall be before the Adonai Elohim continually. And for this the law is no limit of days, for it is forever. They shall observe it throughout their generations, so that they continue supplicating on your behalf of the blood, therefore, on the altar. Every day at the time of the morning and the evening, they shall seek forgiveness on the behalf perpetually before Yah, that they may be kept and not rooted out. And he gave to Noah and his sons a sign that they should not again be a flood on the earth. And he set a bow, his bow, in the cloud for a sign. We're talking about a rainbow, for eternal covenant, and there should not be again a flood on the earth to destroy it in all the days of the earth. And for this reason he ordained and written on the heavenly tablets that they should celebrate the Feast of Weeks in this month once a year. Here's where the contradiction is, because at the beginning of Jubilee 6, it said in the third month. And this is exactly where they get the count of 50 days only, therefore a Pentecost, and not completing the whole. That's a whole nother teaching, guys, but this is one of the contradictions here, because it says you should celebrate the Feast of Weeks in this month once a year to renew a covenant every year. That's incorrect. And because the Feast of Weeks cannot be celebrated in this, because the wheat is not ready at this point. I'm going to show you that in another teaching. So this is one of the things I have a problem with Jubilee 6, but I digress. That's not the point of this teaching. And this whole festival was celebrated in heaven from the day of creation till the days of Noah, 26 jubilees in 5 years. And Noah and his son observed it for 7 jubilees, 1 week of the years in the days of Noah's death. And from the day of Noah's death to his sons did away with it until the days of Abraham, they ate blood. And Abraham observed it, and Isaac and Jacob and his children observed it up to thy days. And in thy days the children of Israel forgot it until it celebrated it anew on this mountain. And do thou command the children of Israel to observe this festival in all their generations as a commandment unto them. So this particular chapter is specifically talking about this wheat harvest, or first fruits harvest, right? Specifically, 1 day in the year of this month they shall observe the festival, for it is the Feast of Weeks and the Feast of First Fruits, the Feast of Twofold and a double nature, according to what is written. That is interesting. A feast of two is twofold and of a double nature. Because what I'm teaching at Passover coming up is actually 2 things that I believe there's actually 2 days, the 50 day and then the 102, which is Shavuot. Pentecost is mentioned at 50 days. I digress, but this is a great revelation to me right here. Let's go on. For I have written in the book of the first law, in that which I have written for thee, that thou shalt celebrate it in its season, 1 day in the year. And I explained to thee its sacrifices, that the children of Israel should remember and should celebrate it throughout their generations this month, 1 day every year. And on the new moon of the first month, and on the new moon of the 4th month. All right, so let's look at that. Warashi in the head of the new month, look, Hadishi, right? Which is a version of Hodesh. We're talking about the new moon. These are written and ordained for it as a testimony forever. And Noah ordained them for himself as feasts for generations forever, so that they become thereby a memorial unto him. And on the new moon of the first month, look at that. Again, Barash, Chodesh, on the new moon. Chodesh is used. So even in the book of Jubilees, Brother Thomas, in the Hebrew, we can see that word does exist. It is a date, and the moon is something we are supposed to be observing. It has got everything to do with agriculture. And on the new moon in the first month, he was bidden to make for himself an ark. And on that day, the earth became dry and opened the ark and saw the earth. And on the new moon in the fourth month, the mouths of the depths and the abysses were closed. And on the new moon of the seventh month, all the mouths of the abyss of the earth were open. See how everything is synchronized to the moon? And on the new moon of the 10th month, the tops of the mountains were seen, and Noah was glad. Everything is synchronized to the moon. And on this account, he ordained them for himself as feasts for a memorial forever. What? He ordained what? The days that are accounted for in each one of these months by the moon. And they placed them on the heavenly tables. Each had written weeks, one from another, past their memorial. And on the first to the second, and from the second to the third, and from the third to the fourth. And all the days of the commandment will be 52 weeks of days, and these will make the entire year complete. And thus is engraven and ordained on the heavenly tablets, and there is no neglecting this commandment for a single year from year to year. And command thou the children of Israel that they observe the years according to this reckoning, 364 days. What reckoning? By the sun and the moon. And these will constitute a complete year. And they will not disturb it time from its days and from its feasts. For everything will fall out to them according to their testimony. Why? Because they're keeping what? They're keeping the Father's commandment and doing it as he says. And he says, and these will constitute a complete year, and they will not disturb its time from its days and from its feasts. Why? Because you're keeping it right. For everything will fall out to them according to their testimony, and they will not leave out any day nor disturb any feast. But if they, here's the section that they like to cherry pick. But if they do neglect and do not observe them, what them? The sun and the moon and the stars, according to his commandment, they will disturb their seasons, and the years will be dislodged from its order. Did you hear and read what I just read? Apparently, the moon has a purpose. It coincides with the sun. And if you don't keep them in its order, all the seasons will get out of whack. He says, but if they do neglect and do not observe them according to his commandment, then will they disturb their seasons, and their years will be dislodged from its order. So actually, Jubilee 6 is telling you, you better keep them in its order. You better observe it right. And I'm going to tell you right now, a fixed day of Saturday is not the order he is talking about. Going on, and they will disturb the seasons, and years will be dislodged when they don't keep it. And they will neglect their ordinances. And they did. Guess what? Hillel was forced to make a calendar under Constantine, fixing the days, and they were forced to do it. And look what it says. And all the children of Israel will forget, and they will not find the path of the years, and will forget the new moons, the seasons, and the Sabbaths, and they will go wrong in the order of years. Guess what? That has happened. Judah is about 230 something years off, and they admit it. And they admit it has everything to do when the calendar was fixed to a Saturday and stopped going by the sun and the moon. The only thing that they observe is the new moon. And if you only observe the new moon, but yet you still fix your days to Saturday, you're wrong. That's not, they made a compromise, the Jews did, the ones that keep the Hillel calendar. They acknowledged the new moon, but they fixed the day to Saturday. That's a fact. And what happened? Israel will forget, they won't find the path of the years, and they will forget the new moons and the seasons of Sabbath. And it all went awry, folks. it's completely off the rails. For I know from henceforth shall I declare it unto thee, that it is not of my own devising, for the book lieth written before me, and on the heavenly tablets the division of days is ordained, lest they forget the feast of the covenant and walk according to the feast of the Gentiles, after their error, and after their ignorance. For there will be those who will surely make observations of the moon. Now, it disturbed the seasons from, and we're talking about observations of the moon only, and disturb the seasons and come in from year to year 10 days too soon. And if I explained that to you, that if you only observe the new moon of the moon, first of all, you're going to have a certain amount of days in a year, and that's 354. If you observe the new moon, which is okay, so there's a difference. Okay, the lunar calendar and the observing the new moon with a 7-day Shabbat. You can have a 1 day or a 2 day where there is no moon in the sky. It's completely dark. And that is going to be roughly 4 or 5 times a year. The rest of the time, it's going to be 1 day. All right. You do the math. That's right at 364 days. Right. We know now from science and from calculation that a solar day is 365 and some change. Right. But I'm telling you, the moon, if you do not observe it correctly, you will go wrong. This is what it's reiterating right here. Because it's saying there will be those who will surely make observation. And by the way, there's those that are trying to do this calendar who make mistakes. You're not going to get it right the first time, the first year. You may come up short at the end of the year. That might happen. But you will get the hang of it. You will get better and better every year, and you will learn from by doing the count from where it starts. And you do it right according to the sun, moon, and stars, which means you do it at the equalization of the clock. What is that? When both hands are pointing to midnight, right? 12 o'clock? Because this is what it is. It's a clock. That's the equinox means equalization. That's when we start over again. Right? So you're starting with a clock that's both hands are pointing up, and they're both making revolutions. One's going faster than the other. Okay? You can't go by just one hand or the other. You will be wrong in your calculations. If you do that with, and by the way, you just heard in the presentation about the Essenes, they primarily went by the sun only. Who else do we know that does that? Rome and the Zadok calendar. No regard to the moon at all. And I'm showing you verse after verse, even in your own text that you guys use in Jubilees, that the new moon is observed. Let's go. For this reason, the years will come upon them when they will disturb the order and make an abominable day. And this is talking about not observing it and observing wrong. Remember, this is an order to it. If you don't do it right, you're going to do it wrong. That's the only way around it. And they will confound the days, and the holy with the unclean, and the unclean with the holy. And they will go wrong as to the months and the Sabbaths and the feasts and the Jubilees. And I've talked to a number of Hebrew scholars, rabbis, and such. And not all of them are Jewish. Some of them are Christian and believe in Yeshua. Okay, that confirm that the calendar it is agreed upon. The calendar, especially the one from Hillel, the Saturday calendar, is over 200 years off. And that's because for every year and every month throughout time, since that time when Hillel did that, it is compiled. It is added up over time. The discrepancy. Okay, this is what Jubilees is telling you here. For this reason, I command and testify to thee, that thou mayst testify to them. For after thy death, thy children will disturb them, so that they will not make the year 364 days only. And for this reason, they will go wrong as to the new moons and seasons and Sabbaths and festivals. And they will eat all kinds of blood with all kinds of flesh. Jubilees 6. Exclusively about the moon. And not only that, we can see in the Hebrew that it's Chodesh when we're talking about new moon. Okay? Now, why is that important? Well, let's look in Psalm 81. We see the very same word. So I'm not blowing smoke on you. All right? At the time of the new moon, B'chodesh, blow the trumpet at the full moon on the day of the solemn feast. Psalm 81. Isaiah 66 is a really interesting one. Take a look at this with me. Isaiah 66. And it shall come to pass that from one new moon, Chodesh, to another, B'chodesh, and from one Sabbath to another, all flesh shall come and worship me, says Yahuwah. So it shall come to pass at some point that from one new moon to the next, and one Shabbat to the next, that all flesh shall come and worship me. That includes those that are on the Zadok calendar. Better get used to the moon, you guys. Y'all created it for a reason. And by the way, it wasn't created by Babylon. That's absurd. Samuel, 1 Samuel. And David said to Jonathan, indeed, the new moon, Chodesh, is tomorrow. And he's going to be with, I told you about this in one of the last videos, where he's supposed to go meet with Saul. Saul. And it's at the time of the new moon. David, Jonathan, Saul, all of them observed the new moon. There was matter of fact, every new moon is a celebration. That's a good thing. It's a dinner at that time, you guys. We're supposed to blow the shofar and declare the new month. It's a good time. And by the way, it's not a burden to observe it. It's kind of wise to do that. So even in our scriptures, and I could go on and on for another 2 hours on new moon alone in our scriptures. Okay. So we've covered the Essenes. We've covered the book, the complete book, chapter 6 of the book of Jubilees. And we've gone into Chodesh and three different verses from the Bible. So, folks, I'm just getting started on this. I got a lot to say on this, and we haven't even got into the fragments yet of the priestly order. Okay, so I am listen, to get to the bottom of anything, you got to deconstruct. You got to deconstruct and put it back together. And I'm telling you right now, I promise you right now, if I find any evidence that this is the calendar we're supposed to keep, I'm bailing on the other one. But that's a large leap. That's a large leap. And right now, it's not looking good for the Zadok calendar, you guys. I'm still open. And I still am open for somebody to come and sit down with me and hold my hand and coddle me a little bit and say, Jonathan, let's take it real slow, line by line, and show me this calendar. I'm asking you, please do that. So that's what I got for you in this video, you guys. I hope that you learned something from it, that you got something out of it. Please share, please like, help me out. I'm working my butt off on this thing for you to get to the bottom of this. So this is because of love, okay? It's not personal at all. Shalom to you. May God bless you. We'll see you in the next one.